Peter Huessy is one of the country's preeminent experts on a subject that in that comprehensive tour d'horizon that the Admiral's given us warrants our special attention, it seems to me, and that is the nuclear forces and their adequacy in terms of the deterrent challenges that we face today. Peter has served in a number of capacities, both in the executive and legislative branches, including under some Democrats. We don't hold that against him, folks. He's come a long way. He is today the president of Geostrategic Analysis and has an extraordinary attribute. He has been the sponsor or host of something on the order of 1,750 events in Washington, D.C., most of them breakfasts or lunches or dinners, where he has brought in really the premier people in our country, many of them in government, some not, to talk about these issues with some of the most influential reporters and policymakers in the country. And so I'm delighted to have him here with us to talk a little bit about, I'm hoping, the nuclear program, but also more generally the condition of our military and what we need to do about it with your help. Peter Huessy.
I want to thank you all for being here today. And as Frank said, I'm Peter Huessy, and let me have the first slide. Mike Morrell is the former and acting director of the CIA, and he said this just last week. I've never seen more threats to our country at any time in my 33 years in the business, I think maybe in the history of our country. Next two slides, please. Go to the second one. I guess it's not up yet. Well, that's all right. How many of you have bought a house in the last 30 years? When you go to the neighborhood and ask to buy a house with the realtor, do you say to the realtor, I hope there are not too many cops in the neighborhood? You don't, do you? The vice president of the Cato Institute last week published on National Review Online an article that said the presence of America's military forces around the world causes terrorism. Now, in that respect, he has lots of company, including Osama bin Laden, including the jihadis, including Iran, including Russia, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Danny Ortega in Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador. And yet, that is also a dominant theme in many of our friends in the media. And what it is about is the international security order, no different than the neighborhood order when you go buy a new house. You ask, is it safe and what are the schools like? Okay? We know what the schools are like in the international security environment. The media, Hollywood, academia, the internet. And the next time I hear somebody on the conservative side say, mainstream media, I am going to commit suicide. They are not mainstream, they're not media. They are advocates and propagandists for the progressives in this world and in this country, and it's about time we said so. Therefore, to look at this issue intelligently, we have to not only understand the order in the world since World War II, when the international security environment was created by the United States and NATO and our allies. What happened in the world? Never before have you seen such a dramatic reduction in poverty and increase in prosperity and the number of jobs created and the expansion of freedom. When George Bush 41 left office, every country from Canada to Chile was free except for Cuba and Haiti. That's not the case today. When you look at the end of the Reagan administration, Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, all had free and open elections, had elected Democratic presidents that were allied with the United States of America. That wasn't a coincidence. Just over a year ago, We didn't know about ISIS, and Russia had not invaded Crimea, and Ebola had not broken out. All those three things, our President and our Congress said to the United States Air Force, go, we need your help. And I'm going to talk to you today about your United States Air Force. I'm a senior defense consultant at the Air Force Association. My boss is General David Deptula, retired, who ran the Gulf War in '91. He was the guy who planned the air power, where we did 47,000 sorties of taking out Saddam's equipment. That was the '91 Gulf War. I'm also a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. I have my own business. I write for Family Security Matters in the Gatestone Institute. But when we did these three things, in the first 6 hours, the first F-15 showed up over the Crimea in Lithuania to reassure our Baltic allies. Shortly thereafter, it was U.S. airmen that broke the ISIL siege in Mount Sinjar and saved 20,000 Christian Yazidis who otherwise would have been murdered. When John Kennedy was president, the United States had $800 billion of trade with the world. Oh, excuse me, I made a mistake. $80 billion. Today it's $3 trillion, and the world as a whole has $23 billion in trade. Who keeps those trade routes safe and secure? Admiral Lyon's United States Navy and the United States Air Force. We keep the air clear of threats to our territory and those of our friends and allies. I lived 2 years in the Republic of Korea. In 1969 and 70, I went to school there. I also went to school during the winter in Korea. The students are out of school. The reason in the winter, if you've ever been in winter in Korea, it's very cold. Students don't riot and demonstrate when it's cold. Historically, students have brought down Korean governments. The Korean governments aren't stupid. They get to go on vacation in the winter. They stay home. But I didn't. I went to Japan. I went to International Christian University, where I went to school as well. Our American military Air Force and our Navy keeps the Korean Peninsula free and clear of the bad guys from the DMZ south. Now, parenthetically, we hear, if you go Google it, that we lost the war in Korea. It is true, we didn't get rid of the North Korean government. It is true, but as someone who lived there for 2 years and goes back often and considers the Koreans as well as the Israelis as brothers and sisters, we won the war. Our soldiers fought valiantly. America protected what is now over 42 million South Koreans that are our fifth largest trading partner. They are a free and democratic country, and I'll tell you what, the alternative would be living under the gulag of North Korea, and I don't give a damn what the media says. We won that war. $17 to 18 million barrels of oil a day come through the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. Without the U.S. Air Force and without the U.S. Navy, that oil would be in jeopardy. If you add in the Suez Canal and the Straits of Malacca, which is between Indonesia and Malaysia, you're talking about 37 million barrels of oil daily, or 70% of all the conventional oil traded in the world on any one day comes through the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal, and the Straits of Hormuz. Now, a lot of people say that when we went over in '91 to kick Saddam out of Kuwait, it's all about oil. Well, would they rather it would be about air or water or food? Would that make them happier? Would the people in the media and the New York Times and Hollywood, would they like not to have 37 million barrels of oil a day not on the world market? They wouldn't be able to drive their Mercedes and their limousines and fly their private planes. But they snarkily say it's what my friend in Israel, Uzi Rubin, calls fortune cookie analysis. It sounds smart. It's actually very stupid. Yes, it's about oil. It is the lifeblood of the industrialized economy of the world that supports 7.7 billion people on the earth, without which literally billions of people would be mired in poverty and die. If that's the alternative they want, why don't they say so? But again, folks, don't be taken in when people say, oh, it's just about oil. Because people say that about Iran, they say that about Yemen. It is not a coincidence that Iran is surrounding the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And if you saw just the other day, a fatwa was issued by the Supreme Leader of Iran saying to the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds forces, which are the two terror organizations in Iran, take down the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You may not like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but if Iran has control of the Persian Gulf and therefore 70% of all the conventional oil in the world, how many nuclear bombs do you think they're going to build with that? And how much leverage, coercion, and blackmail do you think they'll do to us in the industrialized world with control over that? In 2014, our airmen in the U.S. Air Force flew 80,000 airlift sorties. The number is actually 79,445. That's our Air Mobility Transportation Camp folks in Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. We also flew 29,892 tanker missions. That's in the KC-10. The plane is actually somewhere around 55 years old on average. We also did 25 space launches. We also evacuated 16,000 medical patients from various parts of the world. We also flew 20,000, actually 19,959 close air support operations in support of enduring freedom in Afghanistan and Inherent Resolve, which is the counter-ISIS program in Iraq. We also flew 35,163 missions for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and another 1,518 in support of other combat commanders. That comes to every single day our Air Force flies 600 missions to support you and your family and our freedom. 600 a day. But here's the problem. We have a fleet of 5,300 planes, but they average 27 years of age, and less than 50%, as Admiral Lyons said, are combat ready. And the reason is, every time you cut $1 out of readiness, you cut $1 out of the budget. It spends 100% that year. So when someone says to the Air Force, cut $50 billion or $5 billion, the easiest way to do it, if you can't cut personnel, and the budget caps say you can't cut personnel, you either cut procurement and you don't buy stuff, you get rid of research and development, you don't develop what you need for the future, or you take it out of readiness and operations and maintenance. You can't take it out of current sorties and current work, so you take it out so the guy who's in a base can't fly airplanes because they simply aren't mission ready. We have the highest tempo of operations of our Air Force since the end of the Cold War. The highest tempo of operations, and this is under this administration, let alone what you believe we should do. When Ronald Reagan became president, the average age of our Air Force was 12 years old. 12. And we called it the Hollow Army. It wasn't just the Army, it was the Hollow Armed Forces. Ships didn't steam, planes couldn't fly. I remember with General Russ Doherty, the former SAC commander, I went around to literally dozens and dozens of our military bases aboard SAC Transportation Command airplanes. We had civic leaders from Pennsylvania, Delaware, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, and I went as his quote-unquote secretary, because the rule was you couldn't go on more than one, and I went on about 70. And we went to military bases all over America. You would not put your dog in the facilities that I saw in 1981, which we put our U.S. military in. The readiness was so bad, the alcoholism and drug abuse was so bad, the quality of our facilities and our planes were so bad, but every one of those soldiers, the morale you could see on their face had never been better, because who was in the White House? Ronald Wilson Reagan. It makes a difference who is in the White House, and don't let anybody tell you different. As Ace Lyons said, we have the smallest Air Force in our history, but we also have the oldest Air Force in our history. We had in 1990, at the end of the Cold War, 511,000 active duty airmen. That doesn't include the reserve and Guard. We have 200,000 less than that. So our numbers are down and our tempo is up. And while we had 6,300 aircraft at the time of the early Bush administration, the 5,300 looks good, but if the budget caps aren't removed, we're going to go down to 3,700, and of that, only 1,800 are going to be available for use. Now compare 1,800 to 600 that are used every day. You can't sustain that operation, okay? You're combat ready, you might get up to 75, 80%. That takes an enormous amount of readiness and training. You can do it, but you cannot sustain this kind of operation. So we had another way to put it, we had 188 fighter squadrons at the end of the Cold War. We have 49. And if the budget caps go into place, we're going to have 23. We're going to have a smaller military airplane inventory than all our adversaries put together. But remember, they don't have to fight worldwide. Now, you may not like the fact that we're a world power, but as I said, what happened after World War II when we were a world power and we were the person, the country, the people that brought order to the world? What happened to prosperity? What happened to freedom? What happened to people's income? What happened to the world after having almost 50 years of outright bloodshed that if you add up the Nazis, the Communist Chinese, the Russian Communist, Soviet Union, the killing in World War I and World War II, it comes to 200 million people dead. 200 million. And if you look at the number of people since the dawn of the nuclear age that coincided from 1945 with the rise of America, the number of people that died every year as a percent of the total number of people fell by a factor of 406. And if you look at the Chief of Naval Operations, he has a chart that shows from World War I, World War II, and then 1945, it's down here less than 1/100th of 1% per year, the number of people, including Korea and Vietnam and what we've dealt with. There's a connection. But as our Chief of Staff, General Welsh, says, there's no bench left. The team on the field is it. And as he said, our current capability means we could fight a major conflict within 120 days. That's what would be required to get ready. Okay? This isn't Pearl Harbor anymore, where you have months to get ready, because as you know, after Pearl Harbor, our actual first combat was North Africa. Okay? We don't have that luxury anymore. Give you another example. If we had kept World War II's B-17 bombers flying around, and I guess there may be somebody in this room that may have flown one of them. If you kept those around and flew them today, they would be younger than the B-52s, the KC-135s that we are flying today. Okay? We've been on what's called a procurement holiday since the end of the Cold War. We are living on Ronald Reagan's modernization program. We are still living on it. We have tankers that are 52 years old on average, B-52 bombers that are 50 years old on average, and fourth-generation fighters that are on average 25 years old. And as Mark Welsh, our Chief of Staff, has said, quote, "The modernization gap is already closing between the U.S. and its peers, and if we pause, we'll be past and we may not be able to catch up." What's my bottom line? There are three major military programs the Air Force is pushing: Joint Strike Fighter, the KC-46 tanker, and the long-range strike aircraft, which is not a bomber as much as it is also an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance plane, because the only plane that can do that in 2025 will be the B-2, of which we have 21. That's it. Okay, every one of our aircraft that goes up does surveillance, does reconnaissance, does intelligence gathering, as well as dropping ordnance. So what you can do is support this, get rid of these foolish defense caps, and talk to your member of Congress, talk to your state legislatures. Remember, Ronald Reagan said, you can lose in one generation what it took us our entire history to preserve. And though we are claimed that, for example, Mr. Boaz from Cato said on May 6th that global intervention by the United States causes terrorism, let me give you three things about the 1970s. And I apologize. As Jim Woolsey points out, I did work for Jimmy Carter. I was 9 months. I was Assistant to the Secretary of Interior for International Energy Programs, but I quit in August 1980, and I went to work for somebody called Governor Ronald Reagan in his 1980 campaign. So I feel that I have redeemed myself. But in the decade before 9/11, U.S. defense spending plummeted $750 billion cumulatively. In the decade of the 1970s, you can look it up, 24 nations fell to communism or totalitarianism, just as the U.S. created a hollow army and a hollow military. Remember that, 24 nations fell to communism, including the mullahs took over Iran, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, all in 1979. Ask yourself the question, were there consequences to the mullahs taking over Iran in 79, the Soviets invading Afghanistan in 79, and Saddam Hussein invading Iran in 1979? There's someone by the name of Ron Paul said, who cares what flag is planted in what country a couple thousand miles away? Well, there's your answer. Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq. It does matter. It matters enormously. It matters to your sons and daughters, your cousins and nieces and nephews and uncles and aunts and parents, all of whom volunteer to serve in the greatest military in history. And you do not send your child to the grocery store in a car that's 50 years old, let alone get in a commercial aircraft that's 50 years old. For God's sakes, why do you put them in harm's way with a military equipment that can't do the job? If you want this briefing, email me, email Frank. He's going to kill me, but if you would like a copy, my boss, General Deptula, unknowns to me, put an exact copy of very similar briefing together last week about what's happening in the U.S. Air Force. He's a general and therefore got a lot more better slides and pictures and the print's nice. But I'll be happy to send it to you because this is deadly serious stuff. Your Air Force is the best Air Force in the world, but it is in danger of sliding over a cliff, as is the Navy, the Marines, and the Army, because of neglect on purpose. When Jack Lew put in sequestration, he knew darn well what he was doing. He said the Republicans are going to get a choice: dramatically increase taxes and go against everything you believe about economic growth, or if you don't increase the taxes, the Defense Department is going to go down the tubes, which this administration says over and over and over again it's going to happen. They say if sequestration happens or the budget caps, we can't do the job we're meant to do. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the secretaries of all the services, they've said it, not some right-winger like Frank and I. They've said our military goes down the toilet if we don't get rid of the budget caps. Okay, take them at their word. Take them at their word and tell your congressmen and your legislators and your governors, because this is not just something you call up Washington to do. This is the American people got to stand up and get rid of these caps, get rid of these budget caps, and put our nation back on order where it belongs as the leader of the free world and the leader of liberty and freedom, as Ronald Reagan and Harry Truman and John Kennedy and George Bush, Sr. and Father, both have said, in which all our great heroes going all the way back to Washington and the Patriots have said. That's what America needs to get back to. Thanks.
Question. All of us are pretty much aware of the extensive use by this administration of drones somewhat effectively. Given that, what is the financial investment and impact of drones on the Air Force and of their potential for adding to its effectiveness the overall impact of drones by the Air Force and this administration?
There's an upside and a downside. When you use a drone, you can't interrogate the guy you just killed. And the intelligence gathered from grabbing people is enormous. So you miss that. Second, drones only have certain legs, meaning distance they can cover. And you have to have the intelligence that somebody is there, okay? If you look what's going on in the world, whether it's ISIS, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether what the North Koreans and Iranians are doing, drones are $1.7 billion a year in the Air Force budget. They're not cheap, they're great, because they go after targets that you have to go after right away. They don't put a lot of pilots at risk. If you don't have a platform in the area, like an aircraft carrier or a military base, they play an extraordinary role, and you can coordinate it with your host countries. The problem is we have an administration that the media doesn't see drones, but they see American soldiers and airplanes and aircraft carriers and Navy, and so they're adverse to seeing on CNN civilian casualties, which we all should be sad about and try to avoid. But 82% of all the sorties that the Air Force is taking into an area with bombs, they don't drop the bombs because an officer can't certify back to Washington, D.C. that not a single civilian casualty will result as a result of the strike. Now, if you had had those rules of engagement in World War II, we wouldn't still be fighting. We would be walking around doing salutes saying Sieg Heil. I say that as someone who's a first-generation American whose parents fled Nazi Germany, which is why I do what I do. Because my other side of my family, they didn't flee Nazi Germany, and they were murdered by the Nazis. So, as Reagan said, in the 1920s, remember, I have a book on my desk my brother gave me. The Jewish folks in Germany were extolled in every single profession. They were the top of the line everywhere. This was in the 1920s. Look how soon that was all destroyed. It can happen in a Western industrialized democracy. And if we don't get it right, God loved President Reagan, but a lot of Churchill was right. Tony Blankley was right. Mark Stein is right. A number of other people. Victor Hansen, the historian. Liberty is not free, and liberty doesn't come naturally. The great mythology of the left is that peace is the natural condition of humankind, and it's just those evil capitalists, fill in the blank, you keep going, capitalists, racists, imperialists, colonialists, make war happen. It's the total different. War is the natural condition of humankind and has been since wherever you think we may have come down out of wherever. It is the genius of our founders that they found a way to build peace in a country which had ethnic people and racial people from every single part of the world. And our Civil War, yes, was fought over slavery, but you look at the extraordinary ability of this country to bring peace to the world. Our soldiers, our airmen, our diplomats, our industrialists have brought peace and prosperity to more parts of the world more often for a longer period of time than any other force in human history. And America, you are in the heartland. You shouldn't apologize for that. You should get up and say to those who denigrate it, why are you denigrating the greatest force of good in the world that is ever seen?